You are watching original video by Truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us on the web at www.truthdig.com.
I noticed that somehow I was supposed to speak about war and peace. The only broader topic you could have written was life. But it doesn't matter, I just speak about what I want anyway. There's a really great Canadian philosopher I admire very much named John Ralston Saul, and I urge you to take time to read his work. Voltaire's Bastards was a very important book for me, along with another book by, it was actually Patrick and Ralph Nader both gave me the book at almost the same time, and that's Sheldon Wolin's Democracy Incorporated. If I had to pick two books of sort of political philosophy, contemporary political philosophy, that I think are vital, those would be the two. And Saul deals with the breakdown of globalization, the lies, and Bob's written a lot about this, the lies that the proponents of globalization, which he correctly calls a utopian ideology, has sold to the rest of us. He calls the period of time that we live in one of those moments in history where we have yet to formulate new ideas by which we can live and function, and are clinging to those dead ideas that people like Thomas Friedman popularize and perpetuate, but which, with even minimal examination, are exposed as utterly bankrupt and mendacious. I mean, all of the promises of globalization have in fact turned out to be untrue. And Wolin's book, and Wolin is an amazing political philosopher. If you're really into punishment, go get his 1960 work, Politics and Vision, which is one of the seminal texts of political philosophy in this country. It's really an incredible piece of work. I mean, it starts with the Greeks and goes all the way up. But in Democracy Incorporated, he, I think, describes correctly that we no longer live in a functioning democracy, that we live in a system that he calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that, he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, and the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. John Ralston Saul calls it a coup d'etat in slow motion, a line I steal and rarely credit. At least I told him that. I said the first 3 times I did, and then I just gave up. But I think that's right. And I think part of the problem that we have is that the sophistication of the public relations industry is such that we, even those of us who are literate and thoughtful, are made to confuse, or we confuse how we are made to feel with knowledge. And I think that both Wolin and Saul expose the structures of power. And you can't respond rationally to what's happening unless you understand where power is centered. And it's not centered in the personal narratives of political candidates, I believe. It's not centered in the Republican or the Democratic parties. It's centered in Wall Street. And both parties are captive to Wall Street. And I think, you know, I did not support Obama in 2008. And it was largely because of my relationship with two people. One was Dennis Kucinich, who you heard on Monday, and who smelled Obama out really early. And Dennis said, you have to look at Obama's voting record in the Senate. It's 2 years of one corporate giveaway after another, including supporting the death penalty. And Dennis said, you know, when he was a kid, he went to the baseball games in Cleveland, and they'd be ushers up and down the aisle going, get your scorecard, get your scorecard. I'm imitating Dennis. And he said, you know, you got to look statistically at what these people do. And I think that inability to sort of shut off the noise machine and look at what's happening has been very effective. Or the noise machine has been very effective in deluding many of us, or at least masking where the real centers of power lie. And I don't believe that we're going to be effective until we confront those centers of power, which is why I have been very involved in the Occupy movement and in acts of civil disobedience, and I have been at all sorts of stuff, Veterans for Peace, and down in front of the White House, and the flotilla to Gaza, and she actually went. I just helped raise money for it. And in the book, I write Death of the Liberal Class. There's a kind of backstory to that book, actually. It started out, and it's a good lesson for anyone who wants to be a writer, never write someone else's idea. The Knopf which is a big publisher, so my agent was sort of salivating because they have big money, asked me to write a book on the press, you know, and I thought, well, you know, and I didn't want to do it, and I gave a talk at the Ford Foundation with my former foreign editor, who was then the executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, and then Ford said, oh, we think it's a great idea. We'll even give you a grant to write it. So that's when I couldn't turn it down. And I did write it, and I turned it into Knopf. And Knopf, the editor of Knopf, read it, and he hated it. And Knopf said, well, we'll print it, but we're going to assign an editor to take out all the negativity. And of course, what they wanted was the mythical version of the without fear and favor, Watergate, Pentagon Papers, you know, the Fourth Estate. And I actually, you know, happen to believe that the demise of the traditional press, and especially newsprint, is catastrophic for our democracy, what's left of it. But I'm not about to lie on behalf of the institution, and I certainly understand the institution far better than the editors of Knopf. In fact, the editor who was assigned to this book was spending most of his time out there standing outside Tony Blair's office with a tape recorder ghostwriting Tony Blair's memoirs, for which Knopf had paid $4 million. And so I call the Nation books, and when you get an advance, you get half of it up front. So I got Nation to just write a check for the money that I had already been paid and take the book. So Knopf, instead of allowing Knopf to excise the negativity, they just got a check for what they paid, and I took the manuscript back. And in the course of that process of transition, I thought, you know, it's not just the press that's collapsed, but all of the fundamental pillars of the liberal establishment, the church, the liberal church that I come out of, liberal religious institutions, including synagogues, and I mean, you know, where are the Abraham Heschels, the culture, which has been completely decimated and commercialized. I had a great Irish writer as a professor in college, John McGarren, we were just talking about what Patrick was in Ireland when he died, and he said, you know, it was on the front page of all the papers in Ireland. There's still in Europe an understanding that cultural patrimony is something vital to the health of a nation. The destruction of labor, the destruction of the Democratic Party. And so I said, I'll write about the collapse of all of these pillars that once made a democracy possible. And I should say that, and Bob's right, I come out of the religious left. I mean, the heroes in my house when I grew up were figures like Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, who was, if you look closely at King, a radical, the Berrigans, and on June 7th, Dan Berrigan and I, who baptized my daughter, by the way, he's 92, Dan Berrigan's going to join us for a protest in New York. We have been, after the New York City police pushed everyone out of Zuccotti, we held a demonstration and tried to occupy a vacant lot that is owned by Trinity Church in New York. Trinity Church is the third or fourth largest landowner in Manhattan. It has $30 billion worth of property. It's the landlord for Goldman Sachs. It brings in $30 million a year in revenue. The rector of Trinity Church, Cooper, his title is Rector of Trinity Church and CEO of Trinity Corporation. And they, there's a wonderful clip on YouTube of my friend George Packard, retired Episcopal bishop, who is about 250 pounds of him too, climbing up a ladder on that cyclone fence and jumping over. And so about 60 people were arrested. And Trinity won't drop the charges. And Packard was arrested on May 1st with a group of Veterans for Peace when, on the May Day demonstrations, several of the occupiers congregated at the Vietnam Memorial down in Lower Manhattan. Well, it turns out Packard was a platoon leader in Vietnam, a lieutenant, got the Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars, and had a breakdown after the war. There were a lot of killing. He set up mostly night ambushes, and became a priest because of it. And there was a sort of, in the usual confusion of Occupy, a call by some people to hold the park. Others didn't hold, but Packard and about 12 members from Veteran Peace. And, I remember one of the, now Packard's already up because Packard's got to go to trial on June 11th. If he gets picked up again, then he faces 3 months in jail. And I just talked to George, and, he's ready to go. And I remember one of the leaders of the Occupy movement said, Bishop Packard, if they arrest you again, you're 3 months. And Packard said, I'm not going anywhere. I put names on that wall. And he didn't, and they did arrest him. But Dan's coming down, and we're holding a demonstration to ask Trinity Church to drop the charges, which they won't do. Because if Trinity Church will drop the charges against these protesters, then there won't be a trial. And we're going to have a day of fasting and prayer on the steps of Trinity Church, and then this was my idea. I thought we would go over to Rector Cooper's lavish penthouse and hold a Vesper service and serve the Eucharist in front of his doormen. And so when I began writing this book, I wondered, what is it that went wrong? How did we end up where we are? And it led me back to World War I and the figure of Woodrow Wilson, who I think is a very dark figure in American history. I just finished teaching a course in a prison. It's in New Jersey. They segregate the prisons by gang affiliation, so these were all Bloods. And I taught them Leon Litwack's 2 great works, taught at Berkeley. I don't know if you knew Leon. Did you know him, Bob? Yeah. Amazing. After the Storm, The Aftermath of Slavery, and then his great book on Jim Crow, Trouble in Time, which comes from a Muddy Waters song. But I remember reading in that book that even someone as brilliant and aware as W.E.B. Du Bois voted for Wilson in the belief that, and he was very close to Eugene Debs, in the belief that this was the practical thing to do. And the first thing Wilson did, or one of the first things he did when he took office, was resegregate government offices. And of course, it was a decision that Du Bois deeply regretted walking out on Debs. And I turned to a lot of writers of the period, the three who come away with the most integrity of sort of intellectuals are Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, and Dwight MacDonald. Dwight MacDonald, if you don't know him, is just an amazing writer. If you know anything about Chomsky, Dwight MacDonald married into, I think he's a relative. He married a Hedges, and at one point our family had money. But anyway, he married a Hedges. I've got to go check, but she comes from the same place we all anyway. And he took whatever money she had and he founded a losing magazine, much like Ramparts in terms of profitability, and published politics. And he published Bruno Bettelheim, George Orwell, Hannah Arendt, and it lasted 5 years. And Chomsky, it never had a circulation above 5,000. Chomsky credits his entire political awakening to politics. And MacDonald, in one of his essays, Mass Cult, Mid-Cult, he writes about that the fallacy of trying to dumb yourself down to reach the wider culture, that numbers somehow mean something. And politics is a perfect example of how, when you hold fast to intellectual rigor and integrity, you don't count numbers. And Chomsky is probably, of course, the poster child, but there were many others. But MacDonald writes that World War I, he talks about progressive and radical movements. He said World War I was the rock on which they were broken. Because on the eve of the war, and remember Wilson, the war had no popular support in this country. Wilson had run for office, or run for re-election, on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." You had over 70 socialist mayors. You had publications like Appeal to Reason, had the fourth highest circulation in the country, a socialist journal. You had the masses. You had radical unions like the Wobblies that had a kind of broad social vision. I mean, the reason the Canadians have universal health care is because their unions fought for it, for everyone. Whereas our unions, by the time health care was an issue, were so decimated that it was all about the rank and file. And not that broad, those who had that broad social vision had been pushed out. And what happened in World War I was the creation of the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission. And it was headed by a former muckraking journalist named George Creel, who ends his career working for Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon in the House Un-American Affairs activity. And the most interesting figure, the sort of grand inquisitor of the era, is Walter Lippmann, who Wilson, what happens is the collapse of Tsarist Russia raises the possibility that the Kaiser can move 100 divisions over to the Western Front. And the fear is that it would tip the balance against the British and the French. Wall Street had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French. And if they were defeated, it wouldn't be paid back. So suddenly there's all this pressure on Wilson to go into the war. And Wilson accepts. This was also aided, as just a caveat, by the Kaiser's decision to try and create a naval blockade around Britain, and I think he sinks 2 or 3 American merchant ships. And so Wilson decides that he will rule or impose order through the traditional coercive mechanisms of legislation, most specifically the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. And Lippmann says no. He said, in fact, we can create a system of mass propaganda where you will only have to use the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act selectively against those few dissidents who refuse to conform. Mass propaganda has the capacity to seduce an entire population into the war effort. Now, what's important is that this is the first time you have a system of mass propaganda that employs the understanding of crowd psychology, pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. And Edward Bernays, who comes out of the Committee for Public Information, the sort of father of modern public relations, ends up, of course, working for the CIA. He does all the sort of black propaganda for the 1954 Arbenz coup in Guatemala, as well as several other interventions. You manipulate people's emotions, that people are not moved by fact or reason. Bernays, by the way, was Freud's nephew.
This video program was brought to you by Truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us on the web at www.truthdig.com.